Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Professor Paul Kofman, Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economics here at the University of Melbourne. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the unceded land on which tonight's event is taking place, and pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge in our academy. As a community of researchers, teachers, professional staff, and students, we are privileged to work and learn every day with Indigenous colleagues and partners. I extend my respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us here tonight. It really is a great privilege to welcome you all here this evening for the second Agribusiness Fireside Chat. The event tonight was made possible by the very generous support from the Samuel and June Hordern Endowment. And we are very pleased that both Rupert and Annabelle Meyer have joined us this evening. A special welcome to you both. Tonight's discussion, Future of Global Food Security with an Australian Perspective, is an important topic that we need to tackle. The world is experiencing a major food crisis, with impacts being felt from food shortages in vulnerable economies around the world, all the way through to food price hikes in countries like ours. What's the way out of this major food crisis? And can global supply chain become more resilient to future disruptions? We have an impressive panel of industry and academic experts that joins us this evening to explore how Australia, particularly its rural and regional areas, is leading the way in farming technology and innovation to address critical food security challenges worldwide and contribute to sustainable solutions for global food systems. With us to tackle these questions are Professor Bill Malcolm, lecturer in agricultural economics here in the Faculty of Science, Dr. Meadow Purnader, Senior Lecturer and Program Director of the Master of Supply Chain Management in the Faculty of Business and Economics, Ben Fager, Group Sustainability Lead at Cargill Agricultural Supply Chain APAC, Professor Wendy Umberger, Chief Executive Officer, Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, and the panel will be moderated by Professor Timothy Reeves, Doctor of Agricultural Science, Honoris causa, and at the Faculty of Science here too. Tonight's discussion is being recorded, and the recording will be available on our faculty website. Following the panel discussion, there will be an opportunity for audience questions, which will be aptly moderated by Professor Timothy Reeves. And with that, I invite the panel members to the stage, and I'll give the floor to Professor Reeves. Welcome.
Thank you very much for the welcome. I know we're not in the business school, but I am actually a graduate of the business school. I did the advanced management program in 1981, and it was one of the best things that I ever did. Welcome to everybody here. We're talking about a really important topic tonight, and we've got a great panel here. I'm going to ask the panel just to give us a minute, each minute or two, about their background, and so you know that when we're in the question session, where they're coming from in terms of their expertise, etc. So why don't we start at the end with you, Ben?
Thanks, Tim. Appreciate it. Thanks for moderating, and thanks for having me tonight. Ben Fager is my name, and I work for a company called Cargill, which is a private agribusiness food company, headquartered in the United States, but we're a global company operating in 70 countries. We've got about 160,000 staff working in the food, agricultural supply chain. I'm the country representative for Cargill in Australia, and I also lead our commercial sustainability activity in Asia. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Wendy.
Thanks, Tim, and it's a pleasure to be here tonight. So I'm Wendy Umberger. I have the pleasure of being the Chief Executive Officer of a research agency that's basically reports to Minister Wong, so Foreign Affairs and Trade portfolio. So despite agriculture, we're in Foreign Affairs and Trade. And what we do is commission agriculture research and capacity development. So we take the best of Australia's agriculture and food innovation systems, so research and capacity development, and we partner with institutions and governments throughout the Indo-Pacific region to do research and capacity development to improve food security and livelihoods of the people in the countries that we work. And right now we work in 33 different countries in Indonesia. I should say before that, up until about 14 months ago, I was a professor at the University of Adelaide. And I am also an honorary professor here at University of Melbourne.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Bill.
Tonight's a fireside chat, but for me it'd be more like a fireside croak because my voice is a bit dodgy. We live in a time when consumers have never cared more about food or known less about it. And me as an agricultural economist, I've got a job here. I've had a job here since 1980 teaching agricultural economics to agricultural science students. Two of my best I notice are here tonight, which is a real buzz for me. I grew up farming, I love economics, I love putting the two together, and spent a lot of time thinking about we've managed to feed the growing population since the Industrial Revolution. If you go back, continually doubling food supply, doubled, we've doubled it 5 times up till now. And I ponder the next 30 years when we're going to have another 3 billion people around the corner in the poorest countries of the world. We've done it in the past, but the challenge is to do it again under tougher conditions. But
keep your powder dry, Bill.
I'm a technological optimist, and we will see. We'll discuss this tonight.
Thank you. Meadow.
Thank you, Tim. Hi, everyone. I'm Meadow. I'm a senior lecturer at Faculty of Business and Economics and also the director of Master Supply Chain Management. My research has been, for whenever I remember, on supply chain risk management. And my thesis has been on that too. And I started working in the industry, working with industry in Australia, and before that in Iran, where I come from, on supply chain risks. You would say a lost opportunity not to do my thesis on pandemic. I would say yes. But most recently, I think the reason that I'm here is that I was involved in a number of research projects and ultimately submission to Parliament on policy making about food insecurity in Australia and vulnerabilities in our supply chains in Australia that would cause food insecurity. And I'm privileged to be here and looking forward to having a chat today about it.
Thank you very much, panelists. As you can see, we've got a really good panel here. Let me just say a couple of words about myself. I've spent more than 30 years of my career working for and quite often in developing countries around food and nutritional security. And I think that global food and nutritional security is humankind's greatest challenge. There are 850 million people suffering from hunger and malnutrition today, a number that's not going down. It's actually been going up in recent years. 2 billion people malnourished because they don't have sufficient access to key vitamins and trace elements to keep them healthy and productive. And it's not going to get any easier. Global population is still growing at 150 people per minute. They don't all have to have cars, they don't all have to have TVs, but they all have to eat. So we have to produce more food from less land, less water, less greenhouse gas emissions, under climate change, and a lot of other challenges there. And so I was speaking to a couple of the students in agriculture. I'm saying, agriculture is the noblest cause you can be in. I went back to the 50th anniversary of CIMMYT, which is an institution that funded by the richer countries of the world, including Australia, to help the poorer countries of the world in relation to food security, where wheat and maize are the key crops for food security. It was calculated that in the 50 years of CIMMYT's existence, its work had saved 1 billion lives. Not a medical institute, it's an agricultural institute. And so being in agriculture, tackling global food and nutritional security is absolutely critical to us all. And I'll just finish by saying a couple of things which sometimes don't get thought about. Quite often we hear, there's enough food in the world, all we've got to do is spread it around more evenly. Yes, that's true. But that's a bit like saying there's enough money in the world and all we've got to do is share it around more evenly. And there are things to help do that. Humanitarian philanthropists, government development programs. But they're not suddenly going to solve all of these problems, and therefore the same with food. You're not suddenly going to be able to share it exactly as it has to be done. And the last point, which is pertinent to that, is that more than half of the world's food production comes from smallholder farms and doesn't get traded. It gets consumed locally and regionally, more than half of the world's food production. And what we have to remember is that just supplying more food to those people would actually be detrimental, because that smallholder production is not just about them producing their food, it's their livelihoods. So if we just say, oh, well, we can get food in there, you just shoot their livelihoods to pieces. So it's a complex issue, and that's what we're going to be discussing tonight. What the bigger countries can do in terms of that global food supply that gets traded, but what we can do with smallholder farmers who are producing more than half of the world's food at present. So I hope that I've painted a picture for you that we can delve into a little with our panel. Bill, you're going to open the batting. As you mentioned in your introduction, you thought a lot and worked a lot about the nature, history and causes of current and potential future mismatches between world food supply and demand, and the potential contribution that Australia can make to help resolve some of this. So it'd be really good if you could capture a lifetime's work in about 8 or 10 minutes and answer those questions, please.
Opening the batting, I was an opening bowler, but I'll have a go. The rich people don't go hungry. So economists tend to say the world food problem is a world income problem. And certainly in the last half century or more, with good science and good farming, good value chains, we've managed to produce and supply more food than the demand has grown, right? So supply has grown a couple of % a year, demand has grown 1.5% a year. Supply's grown 3 times over the last 50 years and population's grown 2.5 times. So the evidence, and the other bit of evidence that what we have done is that food prices have come down steadily over the last 100 years. In fact, if you go back, you'd go back to the 14th century and look at the price of wheat. With good technology, increasing the supply, the scientists and the economists would say, well, we have been able to increase the supply of food in the last 100 years more than the demand, and you all understand if the supply grows more than the demand, the price comes down. So when I talk to my students about, well, we've done it, they say, what's the evidence? I say the price of wheat in 1908 was $800. Price of wheat today is $3.50, okay? And if you look at the trend, it's been downward ever since. Fluctuates around that, of course, and the Russians invading Ukraine, everything, but around that trend, I would say the good science has delivered the goods so far. And as a sort of optimist, I would say we know how to do it, right? And part of it's economic growth. Economic growth, we know how to achieve economic growth, get the policy settings right, trade, invest in the ag R&D, educate women in the poorest countries. We sort of know what works to get economic growth, which makes people wealthier. Two things that work here. If people have more income, they can obtain the food they need. If the price of food comes down, the poorest people spending their income can buy more food with a limited income. So there's two things that work there. And so my essential argument, Tim, is if we know how to do it, and we knew how to do it, it's a different world. The next 30 years is going to, I say to my students, the things that are going to dominate their careers is hotter, warmer climate, hotter, warmer, drier and wetter and rougher weather, and an extra 3 billion people in the poorest countries of the world. That's going to dominate my students' careers, and I try to equip them to solve problems that don't exist, right? But my argument is essentially that, and it's what my good colleagues who work in this area, Julian Alston and Phil Pardey, for instance, in ag R&D, they call it the magic term, they call it the slow magic of investment in agricultural R&D. And it's certainly going to be harder. I'm not confident it'll happen, but I'm confident we know how we could make it happen. But it's dependent, and I talk a lot, advocate a lot to public policy and government to increase the investment in agricultural R&D because it shows the best return in the economy. Like this, and Wendy's ACR's got a lot of evidence for this too. But any study you look at, average return over thousands of investments in agricultural RD&E, about probably 12%. Benefit cost ratios 10 to 20 to 1. Slow magic, it works. But the worrying thing is, this is the but part, there's always a but, is the rate of increase in investment in agricultural R&D and E, that's extension, by public bodies in the wealthy countries, the rate of increase is declining. Okay, it's still increasing, but the rate of increase is declining. Luckily, India and China are stepping up, and also the private sector is stepping up. But the economics tells us the fact that it gives such a good return tells us we need more investment in it, right? Because the return's much higher than most other things in the economy. So Tim, you're a scientist. I'm putting my faith in you and your profession, allied to sensible economics and sensible public policy, right? Put all that together, we could pull it off. But the jury's out on whether we will.
Thank you very much, Bill. Now, we've had an order of batting, but I'm wondering if we can change it, Wendy, because Bill's been talking about the importance of agricultural research, and, right in your bailiwick, I've got some questions for you, which would be good around that. And I suppose a key one is that you're the chief executive of ACR. Why should Australia support agricultural research through development in other countries? How does that contribute to addressing food security? What are the benefits to Australia? Where in the food chain or food system is research and innovation needed the most? Is it around productivity, or are there other issues that we need to, that Bill alluded to? And how do our challenges in Australia, for example, compare to the Indo-Pacific region where you do a lot of work? And what can Bill talked about research innovation, what can Australia's agricultural and food innovation system contribute to developing countries in terms of food and nutritional security?
Great, thanks, Tim. All right, so the first one there, so why as Australians should we be investing in agriculture R&D in other countries, and ACR, does a lot of that, but I should say we partner with Australian institutions such as the University of Melbourne works on our projects and has for, I think, 40 years. So first of all, something really clear is, I'll use the CIMMYT example. So we fund CIMMYT as well as other countries do. So CIMMYT's the maize and wheat research institution that's based in Mexico. 98% of the varieties of wheat currently grown in Australia came out of CIMMYT. So came out of Mexico. So varieties of wheat that came out of a development institution are varieties that you all eat every day if you eat wheat. Some people don't, but yes, so that's an example. But let's talk biosecurity. So biosecurity is a massive issue for agriculture, right? And what a lot of the research we do is helping countries solve or prevent biosecurity issues. So foot and mouth disease, anyone that travels and went to Bali, for example, you might have had to go through certain things, putting your feet through a couple of years ago when foot and mouth disease happened. So actually, our research, actually a project I was working on, did a lot of work with farmers that helped understand what was happening with foot and mouth disease and helped hopefully prevent it from coming into this country. So ACR and development research, working with countries, has helped keep multiple diseases out of Australia. So we view that by doing the research in countries before it gets to Australia is much better for our industry, our agriculture sector, and our food prices than having to address and do research once it gets here. So our research keeps biosecurity issues, pests and diseases out. The other thing, so I just came from Pakistan on Sunday. I was there all of last week, and I'll use that as an example. It's a really recent one. So Pakistan, like Australia, is a very dry country that's absolutely being hugely impacted by climate change and the volatility. And so we're working on things, pulses and wheat and citrus products. So our departments of ag, our universities, and doing some modeling even on water issues to say, okay, as climate changes and our climate has things that happen like what's happening in Pakistan or other countries or Vietnam, salinity issues, we can understand how we might address those here in Australia. The other thing, today I talked at the government's inquiry into agriculture, Australia's role in agriculture in Southeast Asia this morning. And one of the things we talked about is research and capacity development that we do, not just ACR funds, but DFAT funds, and even the universities put funding in and scholarships to students. It builds really strong networks and really strong understanding of each other's agriculture sectors. It helps us trade products there. So not just our commodity agriculture products, but also services, so IT issues, different technologies. And the other thing is we actually get market intelligence from that. So work, for example, I'll talk about research that I did in Vietnam and Indonesia on understanding markets. So I'm a behavioral economist, and we look at why people do what we do and how we can change behavior. And so we did big projects in Vietnam and Indonesia, 4 ACR projects, to understand the market end of dairy and horticulture products. But actually then it helped our grain producers to understand those markets, our dairy sector to understand those markets. So what people, if they haven't traveled to those countries, often don't understand is places like Indonesia, Pakistan, Vietnam, all throughout Southeast Asia have very huge populations. Jakarta has a population bigger than the entire population of Australia, right? And a huge middle-income economy where the disposable income of people there and in places in Vietnam and Malaysia, throughout Southeast Asia, is much more than my own buying power, for example. So if we can understand those markets, we can understand agricultural products and services that might be of value to those markets. One thing that I often talk about, so ACR is such a unique agency, and people say, so why are you in foreign affairs and trade? And mostly diplomacy, right? Why are you not in the Department of Agriculture? And so the minister tells me all the time that the work that we do is very important geopolitically. So it's important because if we can improve the agricultural economies of the countries in our region, by improving the agricultural economy, by helping smallholder farmers, which makes up a large share of the population in the countries in our region, then that's improving GDP in these countries and leading to more wealth, more political stability, and reducing the need for humanitarian aid. So the biggest thing, we haven't talked about it much yet, Bill started to talk about it, but the biggest thing, the last 6 months I've spent, every other week I've been in somewhere in Southeast Asia or Asia, meeting with government and our partners, because we sit down and talk about what are your priorities and find out what's the best expertise, how can Australia help. The biggest thing that's being raised with me in every country, small country, Vietnam, Indonesia, but even Laos, PNG, throughout the Pacific, is climate change. Help us address the issues that our farmers and agri-food sector are facing as a result of climate change. And I think the last question you had there is, where should we be investing in that value chain? So interestingly, ACR, when it started in 1982, so Bill's been working longer than our agency. So I should say that because we've been talking about being around for 42 years. And I'm thinking, well, Bill's been doing this for 44 years. And of course, I'm not even that old, but I'm 50. But actually, what's happened is initially when ACR got started, we were mostly dealing with agriculture science issues. And most of the research we funded was more technical agriculture. So people like Tim, people doing very basic agriculture sciences. Now the work we do, it's almost like the name of our agency doesn't fit, because we're working on that entire food system. And one of the biggest things we're being asked to fund, both in terms of research and capacity development, is things we as economists like to talk about, and that's agriculture policy, and helping us think what policy mechanisms are needed to help our sector address the different food system issues. So we now work and on all aspects of the value chain, not just increasing productivity, post-harvest, different negotiating value chain issues that are right in line with you, policy issues, food waste, circular economy, water. Some of our biggest projects are actually in water and marine restoration to help, because that's really important, in fish pathways, interestingly, to help make sure that fish can travel when dams are built, that they can get downstream. So we do environmental work too, and then all sorts of climate. So every aspect of that food system, including policy, including supply chain, is absolutely a critical part of solving food security and helping improve food security and nutrition security, and even addressing water issues.
And ACR is an example that the rest of the world wishes they had. Does actually fantastic work of putting scientists in developing countries that we're working with together with Australian scientists working on projects of mutual benefit, as Wendy has just clearly outlined. Also talked about supply chain, so this really leads to you, Meadow. And if we think about Australia, what are the main issues in sort of food supply chains here? And as was said in the introduction, my goodness, we actually saw empty shelves here in Australia, which was a shock to everyone.
Mostly toilet paper, but...
Yeah. No, pasta and rice as well. So, there's been a lot of reports done lately. How do you find the recommendations, for example, in Craig Emerson report on the Food and Grocery Code of Conduct Review? Last year, the Australian Parliament released a report called Australian Food Story, Feeding the Nation and Beyond. What are some of the recommendations in there, and how effective do you think they will be? So we're very much now back here in Australia, supply chains.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, I mean, there have been a lot of good discussions, and obviously about supply chains and affordability of food. I think it's good to have a perspective about what is food insecurity. So sometimes we cannot access food, as happened during COVID, for example, pasta, as you mentioned, or rice. Sometimes food is there, but we cannot buy it because we cannot afford it. So both of them are food insecurity. So the latter, obviously, where you cannot buy the food that is already available to you, is because of the economic situation and affordability. And in fact, we thought 10 years ago, there was, in 2013, there was a national food plan, very ambitious plan that the government issued. There wasn't any mention of, not much mention of food insecurity in Australia. There was ambitions about exports, et cetera, et cetera. But when the interest rates went up, the cost of living crisis appeared, then food insecurity also, with respect to affording food, came into prominence, and it was all over media. And then the discussions, as most of you know, about the two grocery giants in Australia, Woolworths and Coles, and Aldi and Metcash, the fact that they're dominating the supply chains and they might be involved in some price gouging. So we have got two types of food insecurity. I am personally doing more work on the supply chain side of it. And I was involved in it around 2 or so years ago when there was a war in Ukraine, and you might wonder, what does the war have to do with food insecurity in Australia? And well, that's a good question, because any disruption in global food supply chain might potentially affect Australian supply chain. For example, we might, probably Wendy knows better, import some fertilizers to Australia from outside, where the supply chains are, global supply chains for fertilizers, for example, are disrupted, or anything like COVID or war happens, it is connected to Australian supply chain in terms of agriculture or the broader supply chain. When we have got the interest rate rises, it affects the fuel cost. Guess who uses the fuel? Farmers use the fuel. People who do the transport and distribution use the fuel. The warehousing use the fuel. The grocery stores use the fuel. So if the price of the fuel goes up, it has a snowball effect throughout the supply chain. And also, for example, during COVID, we had an issue with the skilled labor. We still do. We still have issues with skilled labor, not only in the upstream supply chain, but throughout. For example, we have shortage of truck drivers. I work with Faculty of Engineering and the Transport Group, and every now and then that we have got an industry speaker, one of the major issues is that not so many people these days, young people, want to do truck driving. So I think, but the most important reason behind the parliamentary inquiry into food insecurity in Australia was the cost of living crisis. And there were some very good suggestions in that report. For example, we need to have an updated national food plan. Considering the situation with the economy and obviously COVID, we need to see where we are at. We need to see what are the vulnerable points in our supply chains. We need to map our supply chains. We need to have a strategic plan about if we have another pandemic or if we have another disruption geopolitically, what are the food supply chains that are in most danger? What should we do? What should we do as a contingency plan? Another interesting suggestion that came from our university, and my colleague Rachel Curry was, and the parliament took it up, was having a minister for food. Some countries have that, and it has been a successful experience. If you have a national food plan, and if you have a national food strategy that spans across energy sector, transport sector, agriculture sector, and various industries, who is going to be coordinating all those efforts? And that was one other suggestion in that report that I haven't heard much from that, where we are going to have a person who is going to be solely responsible for coordinating food supply chains across Australia. So that's another issue. Now, that report from Parliament came out December last year. In February 2024, we had a report by Professor Fellow about price gouging by the Woolworths and Coles and Metcash and Aldi, mainly Woolworths and Coles, and the effect of price gouging. So that's a really interesting report. So just if you haven't had a look at it, different techniques of price gouging that is being exercised by supermarkets have been discussed there. It's fascinating. But then the primary solution in Fellow's report about how to tackle price gouging is increasing competition in the market. Increasing competition in the market from an economist point of view, I think it is a valuable solution. Sometimes though it works, sometimes it doesn't. So in the banking and finance sector in Australia, where there is kind of an oligopoly problem, similar to our grocery supply chain, which is by the way a problem in industries in Australia, it has not worked. So if you add another competitor in the market, what is the guarantee that you are going to have better prices for the consumer? Even if you do, what would happen to the supply side? Because the whole supply chain is not only consumers, suppliers are also under pressure. So if you want to have a viable supply chain, you need to also take care of your suppliers. That is when and I'm going to make it quick, that is when the report by Craig Emerson came out. And Craig Emerson focused on the supplier side. He's saying that, and this is not yet passed, I think there's going to be some follow-up next year on that, we are going to punish supermarkets if they're mistreating suppliers. Okay, so what are you going to do about it? So Craig Emerson suggested that we are going to have penalties of up to $10 million in various ways for the supermarkets, and we encourage the suppliers to blow the whistle on the supermarkets. And again, I'm not sure how effective that's going to be. I have been talking to various small suppliers in different industries, for example, in beer supply chain. You might not know, but most of the beer supply chain is owned by Japanese companies. Like we produce local beer, like we own like a little bit share of the market. So, and then I was talking to some of the suppliers, said, how are you going to deal with that monopoly in the market? And are you going to blow the whistle on for example, on those big companies? And they said, no, we do not dare doing that. I mean, it's not going to be viable for us. So there is some good policy making and some thinking and some talking going on, but in terms of how effective it's going to be, I guess we'll see.
Thank you very much, Meadow. And you nicely segue because you've been talking about the private sector, supermarkets, etc. And so, Ben, you're work for Cargill, one of the famous agricultural companies. From your perspective, how can we drive food security and sustainability outcomes concurrently? Or the way I put it to my students, how can we feed the world without wrecking the planet? And that's the major challenge that we face up to. What role does the private sector have in that topic? What are some of the things that Cargill are doing that actually that promote productivity and food security and also sustainability? And what do you think when you're looking at the work that you're doing, what are particular challenges in developing countries compared to Australia?
Well, thank you, Tim. They're great questions, broad questions, and so let's start with the private sector. I work for a commercial organisation, and it's interesting. I was talking to someone the other day about this and talking about our interest in food security and climate, and they said, "Well, you work for the private sector, so you've got a vested interest." And I said, "Absolutely, we do." And they nearly choked down the water, but after that, I explained that we work in the agricultural supply chain business. And so if agricultural supply chains aren't sustainable, we don't have a business. So that's a vested interest, I guess. I explained that our shareholders, we're a private family company, have set ambitious ESG, environmental or climate targets, and they expect us to hit them. So we have an interest as the custodians of the company to meet those objectives. Our customers expect us to deliver outcomes for them. And so as a private company, we have a significant interest in meeting our customers' needs, both at the demand, what we call the demand point in the supply chain, feed, food, fuel, but also at the farming end of the supply chain, because growers, whether they be smallholder, family farm or corporate farms, are our customers as well. And so we do have an interest, and we also are in the risk management business. And when you look at the challenges in the food system, whether they be in terms of access to technology, access to capital, geopolitical issues, policy issues, then obviously that can have a huge impact in terms of our business. So we've got to manage risk. And finally, Tim, if you look at the climate challenge, that poses a significant risk to the food system and therefore our business. So I'm being a little bit flippant, but do we have a vested interest? Yes. And I would advocate we need the private sector involved in this. I would also say, from a private sector representative, that we can't do it alone, which goes to my second point, which is about capability. So when I hear my fellow panel members speaking tonight, I hear a lot of things about capability, whether it be scientific capability, whether it be economic, whether it be capital, whether it be R&D capability, and we just happen to have good capability in Australia that can be relevant to Australia, but the global food system, given our place in it. And the other important capability point I would talk about, particularly in this setting, is human capital. So I talk about capability and about partnership, because early in my career in the private sector, people tended, and this is not a comment about a company, it's just a general observation, people tended to think you could do this all yourself. So you'd manage the value chain, in fact you'd invest in the value chain, and you would do that end to end yourself. And that is just simply, in the modern world, with the challenges we have, not a viable option. One, we couldn't, and two, it wouldn't make sense for us to think we could do that ourselves along that value chain, which goes to the last point, which is an example, because you asked for one. Just pick one. Pick one in Australia that's relevant that we're looking at globally. We work with growers, canola growers. I can see some in the room. They're good at what they do. They farm sustainably. They've got access to technology. They've got access to data. They want to grow their business. They're interested in productivity and sustainability. You can't get around that. And in fact, we won't undertake the challenge unless you work with the people that manage the land and water resources in all its forms. This is an example of a canola farmer. We help those canola farmers baseline their emission profile. We help incentivise them to use new technology, additional technology. We help them measure that, and we trace that through the supply chain to our end-use customers to help them decarbonise the supply chain. We're not doing that alone. We've got our particular point in the supply chain, but you need the farming sector, you need the technology, you need the research, you need the capital, you need the measurement, you need the supply chain, you need the customer, and indeed the customer, in many cases, willingness to pay to put that commercial operation together. That's a decarbonisation program that supports productivity. It's an and to an environmental outcome. It's not an or, and we're looking at ways to do that in developing countries, and it's difficult for all the reasons that everyone in this room would know about in terms of smallholder farming and access to capital and different models and technology and regulatory issues and on and on and on. But Tim, they're the types of models we're looking at, incentivising farmers through the supply chain to drive food security through productivity and decarbonise. They're good at it. We need to help connect that supply chain at our spot in it and realise that our place in it is not every place. They would be some introductory comments.
Thank you. Well, colleagues, you've heard from our four speakers and some great points have been covered. There's an opportunity now for Q&A. So if any of you have any questions that you would like to put to the panel, I think we've got a microphone or two going around, and you're most welcome. So, yes, please, we'll start with that gentleman there.
I noticed that population was touched on, but it seems that global population growth is a given, and traditionally agrarian societies have relied on growing families to manually plough the fields and so forth. But I wonder if any of the panel have a perspective on whether global population growth is just a given, or whether we can do more, for example, by empowering women to be equal partners in their relationships to decide on whether to grow their families.
Thank you. Wendy and Bill.
So really good question. So I think populations are growing, and we know the number of people working in agriculture is going down, right? And my own family just had their machinery auction overnight in South Dakota in the US, and no one's gonna, some other family is gonna renting out our land and stuff. So things we all need to do, anyone involved in agriculture, is agriculture is not a male or a female role. It's not a young or an old. And in many countries, Australia included, people working in agriculture are getting older and older. We absolutely have to do things to encourage youth to get involved in agriculture and women. And that's something that we actually work a lot on in ACR. But in the countries where we work, in all of them, particularly in the Pacific and Africa, massive young people population struggling to find jobs and work. We're lucky we have plenty of work opportunities in Australia, but other countries don't. And agriculture has so much opportunity in terms of the innovation going into it, and we need to bring those brilliant minds that even people going into engineering, those engineering skills are needed in agriculture, the IT skills needed in agriculture. Women, absolutely, encouraging them and giving them opportunities in agriculture, including in our own country. I think yesterday was National Day of the Women Rural Farmer, right? And so that has taken off here, but Pakistan, an example where women empowerment is an issue. And when we went to, and this is many places that we work in the region, so we have had to do work in our projects of showing ways to bring women into the farming business. And so traders have been a very important part in Pakistan, as they have been in Indonesia, in projects I've been involved in. And women are better at doing certain aspects of value chain. For example, pulling out, once crops are harvested, citrus in this case, deciding which ones are gonna go to the high value market versus the local market, because they're involved, it's smallholders producing mangoes as well, where women can select the high quality crops better when they're picking, when they're sorting, when they're doing those things. Women are better marketers as well. In places like Indonesia and Vietnam, women are much better at going to the market and negotiating price, and it's a great job for women. They're much better about also, when they get the money, investing it back into the household. Research in very good journals suggests this, and investing it into household nutrition, bringing protein into the diet. We haven't talked at all much, I think you mentioned it a little bit, but one of the biggest issues in developing countries, this is even an issue here in Australia and in the US and high income countries, is the nutrition. So people getting plenty of calories, but not getting the right amount of calories. So stunting, all kinds of obesity, it's about getting those right calories. And so when you can do training in women, with women to get them understanding what nutrition is needed for households, then they know that they need to bring more protein in, certain types of vegetables. It differs country to country what the nutritional issue is, but protein is always a big one. And so when they have ability to have cash and be empowered, some of it's convincing the male in the household that it is actually okay to let your spouse get involved in the agriculture sector and reducing the stigma. It's changing in places, and they talked about that. The men talked about it. And that's through the projects that we're doing. It'll take time, but I can tell you, when I started out my career, even in research, I used to be the only woman sitting around the table in agriculture at universities, and now it's at least 50-50, if not more sometimes. But that's changed in my career. And yeah, like I said, I just turned 50 in July. So, that's the thing I said in Pakistan, that I encouraged the men, like, this table where there's one or two women looked like that 25 years ago. And now it's the other, because people cared. So I say to the men, you have to be the ones helping the women out here and encouraging and mentoring women as well. So I don't know if it answered your question, but it's not just women, it's also youth and young people, and showing them that there's opportunity in this sector. There's so much, like, if there'd been the opportunity in agriculture today that there would have been, in the 80s and 90s, many of us probably would have stayed in farming. There's so much more excitement now in terms of the technology.
Absolutely. I mean, just undergraduate students in agriculture school, well, when I left 3 years ago, there were more women than, more females than males. So in the intake seats.
And better students, Tim.
Yeah.
But on the bigger picture, sorry, I've got the answer to this population problem, and the answer is you make people richer. The demographers from FAO, whatever, will tell us that world population, and I ask this question to students and farmers, world population may get to maybe 11 billion by 2100. And then I say, what will it be by 2300? And the students say, 50 billion, 70 billion, 100 billion, right? The fact is, at 2300, it'll be less than 11 billion in 2100. In fact, they're even reducing their projections now. Because this is the beauty, this is the double. Economic growth gives you the double. It makes food available more cheaply and it stops the population growing. That's the key. As people get richer, they have less kids. Poor people get richer, they have less kids. The rich countries' population is declining. The opportunity cost of having kids goes up. Women get in the workforce. Economic growth is the answer to the population growth.
Which brings back to that earlier point we were talking about, about helping those smallholder farmers generate more income, because the evidence shows that when that goes, first of all, it gets spent on education and health, and it gets spent on girls' education, which has always been traditionally a secondary, and then once you get from there, you have lower birth rates. But it's a really good point that you made. I had the privilege of working with Norman Borlaug, the Nobel Peace Laureate in 1970. And if you go back and look at his speech, his Nobel speech, he says, what we've done with these agricultural breakthroughs, we've just bought time, and these are his words, not mine, until we control the population monster. Now, he said that 54 years ago. Politically incorrect, but Norm, is a Nobel Peace Laureate, so I guess you can say. But it has been at the forefront of thinking for a long time. Yes, please. The gentleman there, yep, and then we'll come to you.
Hi, David Byrne from the University of Melbourne. Just curious from the panel, particularly on the private sector side, just what's happening with artificial intelligence and data in agriculture. Are you seeing any breakthroughs there that can help with some of the productivity, I guess, gains that we're trying to look for? Is there any frontiers there?
Look, I couldn't even list what I see in terms of breakthroughs, in terms of technology, AI, particularly in the space I work, which is sustainability. And I think that often the things that are really good in the media are great sort of lightning rods to go towards, like when they're scanning now on the livestock, that you can tell the health of the livestock, and the nutritional, because we're in the feed nutrition business, and I mean that we put out an investment or a press release in that, and you can hub towards it, and I can give the examples. But I think it's the baseline systematic data management behind the scenes. It's not so high profile where a lot of the action is. And there's just so many good examples and so many smart people, not just, and we were talking about it before actually, not just working as agricultural experts in this space, but working as experts in this space that we can get involved in agriculture. Which goes to a little bit to your point about the exciting thing about agriculture. I mean, don't want to get off the point, but just to support you, when I was early in my career and I'd go to a dinner party and we'd go around the room and people would say, what do you do? And the banker and the plumber and the doctor and the artist, and it would come to me and I say, I'm interested in agriculture, and people would say, sorry. And now you go to a dinner party and the banker and the technologist and the medical science person want to get involved in the sector, including in artificial intelligence and data. Point one. And point two, quickly, Tim, is in the area that I work in terms of sustainability programs, you can't do it without data. because you can't trace it through the supply chain if you don't have data, including data from the farmer, in a form that he or she is willing to share. Because then you can't measure it. If you can't measure it, you can't then manage it, and also you can't demonstrate to people, including people outside agriculture, consumers and investors, that you're not greenwashing and you're actually doing what you say you were going to do. So your point about data is absolutely critical.
And I mean, just adding to it, I think a lot of the breakthroughs that are going to affect food and nutritional security are going to come not from agricultural science. They're going to come from material science, from information technologies, etc. I mean, just one, and this is not a great example of AI, but I tell it in the audience that farmers now do not steer their tractors. You know, they just sit on auto steer, 2 centimetre precision. You can choose whether to plant between last year's rows or next to them, etc. You know, and most people go, no, that's not right. You can't be. But I mean, it's just an example of technology and how it's being used in farming. This gentleman here. Sorry, and then I'll come to you. Could you give a microphone to this gentleman, please?
I think the question about AI before has moved off the question I had, and that is, would any of you be out there sponsoring any of the cooking shows to get a better understanding of agriculture, as opposed to Coles and Curtis Stone and all the other varieties we see on the TV, that improves the nutritional understanding and gets us away from the prepackaged stuff in the freezer?
Yeah, very good point. Who would like to comment? Bill, would you like to comment on that?
Well, the first thing I would say is the ignorance of agriculture today in general public is profound, and the connections with agriculture are profound because the world has changed. We're an urban society, more urban, one of the most urbanised societies in Australia, in the world, in Australia. Yeah, and I got no sensible response to you other than to sort of bewail the profound ignorance that I run into of understanding of agriculture. And if a large section of, like, it's only 2% of the GDP, so you might say, why does it matter? Well, it matters for export earnings and things like that. It matters economically, and it matters every day because everybody has their breakfast. But the absolute non-knowledge about anything about modern agriculture, except from people who are doing it or are working in the value chain, I've been an educator all my life, and it still astonishes me that so many people know so little. And as I said earlier, people have never been more concerned about their food and they've never known less about it. That's my best response.
I used to say, you know, in supermarkets should be notices up, say, fresh food, thank a farmer. And people go, oh, food and farmers, oh. I thought, you know, but I mean, literally, as Bill said, there's a big gap there and it's getting bigger. Yes, please. Can we get a microphone, please?
Hi, I'm Laura, and to Ben and also Tim's comment, I'm an ex-banker. I've been in banking for so long time and joined agriculture banking since 2013 and just finished 2 years in ESG and climate team at Westpac. Talking about banking, in particular in Westpac, the ESG and climate team, it was set up by ex-general manager of agribusiness in Westpac, Steve Hannon. That was my old boss. Why I want to share that with you before I pop a question back to the panel is around agriculture as industry has huge credibility in commercial business like Westpac. It's a very diversified industry, but when Peter King, like CEO, looking around his executives say, who is going to do this for me? The industry itself has shown we got onto, you know, the front foot of tackling climate change and, you know, managing the impact and thinking about how do we get through this pathway and just by the can-do attitude. So I think that's something inherent in our industry. We can problem solve. So this leads to my question is around technology and R&D. And we know with ag, most of the emissions coming from methane from livestock. And a lot of that net zero pathway for 2030 or 2050 is still heavily focused on technology improvement, which is most of them don't even use this today. So what is your perspective, your reading into the technology advancement for helping ag industry to decarbonize, to reach net zero?
Thank you. Wendy.
So yes, technology is absolutely vital, and that's all types of technology, from new breeds of livestock, because cattle does livestock, the red meat sector gets attacked a lot. But actually anything, not anything, but lots of work that we do to increase productivity. So that can also lead to lower emissions. And so a lot of this is, again, a need for more R&D in the agriculture system to really address this emission issue. And that's something countries are asking us to help them with, is not just climate resilience, not just helping their smallholders adapt, but also figure out ways to mitigate. So soil there's so much demand for more research on soils and work to improve soils, to look at how the system can be changed to do more mitigation, because all the countries we work with have to contribute as well. One thing I want to mention, the private sector. So when it comes to technology and smallholders, the biggest partner for agencies like us is actually the private sector. And I'll use an example. So rice, I mean, everybody's heard of Sunrice, Australian company. And Sunrice has been where we can show a win-win example that's related to climate. So to export to the European Union, very strict climate sustainability issues, and also needing to have low residue to no residues on the crops. So Vietnam wants to export to the European Union. They did already, having issues with that. Sunrice wants a new source of rice to also expand its markets. And Sunrice is a critical partner with us, with Vietnamese farmers and the Vietnamese government, on helping get the technology, get the systems, including traceability systems, to those smallholder farmers, and working with them on building capacity, investing in the infrastructure needed. And it's win-win for the smallholder farmers, for Vietnam, and for Sunrice. And so when it comes to technology, oftentimes we need the private sector to help with the investment, to help with the capacity development on all different, we have several different examples. But I just really want to say we pick on the private sector a lot. We pick on the companies, but actually it's absolutely critical to have involved to address this food security and to address this problem of reducing emissions and getting innovation to happen, and helping smallholders, helping large-scale farmers, whatever country you're living in.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, that's the end of the Q&A, but it's my very great pleasure to invite our sponsor to the stage, Rupert Meyer, AO. So Rupert, please.
Thank you very much, Tim, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Partly to thank our hosts, Paul Kofman and the Faculty of Business and Economics. Thank you to our panellists. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to those who asked questions. Thanks to the canola growers who are apparently present. Tim, you really set the tone of the evening when you spoke about agriculture as the noblest cause there is, and I think that was picked up by one of the questioners as well. It was such an elegant framing of the discussion, and that was followed by four very elegant framings of different parts of the debate. Having a discussion like this really sort of draws different points of emphasis. I really like the global perspective, the technological optimism, Bill, I think was one of your expressions, and that connection to AI, the policy prescriptions, I suppose, coming from what was being said, the way in which data sits, and the overriding presence of climate as a very relevant element in this whole discussion. I love some of the language that was used tonight. Good science has delivered the goods. The slow magic of investment in agricultural R&D. What a fabulous expression that is when you're talking to policymakers and thinking of what investment actually looks like. The intersection with biosecurity is a very relevant factor. Fish pathway, I really like that expression, Wendy. I don't know where that came from, but it was a very nice mental image. The sense of what a national food plan might be, the granular analysis of the supply chain that was spoken of, how we feed this world without wrecking the planet. What a great sense to take away. The encouragement of youth and women in this whole agricultural area and having their deep involvement. The economic growth is the answer to population growth, which is, again, a really fabulous sort of framing of this issue. And the comment that we've never been more interested in food and more ignorant about agriculture, which I think is a challenge to all of us to get out there and speak about the value of agriculture, what this sector is, how it connects with everything that really matters right now. So thank you. It's a real pleasure for Annabelle and me to be involved in this. My maternal grandparents, Samuel and June Hordern, were pastoralists, and they cared deeply about the community in which they served. And I think they'd be thrilled 50 years on to know that a discussion like this was taking place, so well informed, so considered. Thank you for all being here.
Thank you very much, Rupert, for your great words. Well, we're closing. I would like to thank very much our panel members for doing such a great job. Thank you. And I'd also like to thank you for being such a great audience, so thank you. And as always, again, Rupert, thank you to you and Annabelle. Fantastic indeed. And thank you very much.